everyone, my name is Giovanna Proença and I am from DARS Coding School. Here we have a super video explaining the basics, fundamentals for programming in C language. So with our students we saw that it's a big step going to the Pset 0 from CS50 to Pset 1. So in order to solve this problem, we create a list of 20 problems, so this jump gets a little bit smaller, okay? So I hope you enjoy this content. Problem 1 of Programming Fundamentals. So first of all, we're going to read the question and then we're going to solve the code, okay? So here I comment the question, okay? So it's ask user for 2 integer inputs, print which one of them is the largest. So here, if we check on the CS50 notes, we have to start including the library that we're going to use. And this library, we include them with lines like #include and the stdio.h, that it's the main library that we use when we're coding in C, okay? So first, we're going to call this library. So remember, #include stdio.h, okay? Because in this library, as we can see here, contains the printf function and another functions that we were going to use while we do this problem, okay? And then I don't know if you remember when we do Scratch, we had the when green flag clicked block, right? So this when green flag clicked block, it's the same as this int main void. So everything we're going to do in our code, we're going to do inside this int main void, okay? So remember, int main void, and we have to open and close with curly braces. And remember, this have to be with the same indentation, okay? So if we do this here, printf hello /n and closing with the semicolon, if we make problem 1 and then we run problem 1, it's going to appear here in our terminal hello, okay? So by now it's working our code. But the first part that we have to do is this part, ask user for 2 integer inputs, right? So if we check on the CS50 notes, we're going to see that CS50 create a library where we can get numbers from the user using this getInt function here, okay? And in order to do that, we have to declare a variable and use the getInt in storing the value that we're going to get from the user in this variable here, okay? So we're going to do this first. As we're going to use a CS50 library, remember we have to include the CS50 library in our code. And then we're going to get this integer using the getInt function. So remember, when we're declaring a variable, we have to declare which type it's this variable. In our case, it's an integer, so it's int. I'm going to call the variable as x, but you can call with any name you want, okay? And then I'm going to store the getInt. And this that I'm putting inside the parentheses here is what is going to appear in the terminal in order to the user understands that he has to put a value of integer for us, okay? And then don't forget to close with the semicolon. So just for us to check if everything is working, we're going to see if our value is stored in the right way in our variable x, okay? And we're going to use this %i to get the value of this variable, and we have to specify which variable we're taking this value here. So we declare here x to the terminal. The compiler understands that we're getting this value here, okay? So let's check. Make problem1. It's everything fine. / problem1. So if we put here 5 as the value of x, it's going to print for us 5 as the value of x. So by now everything is running okay. So we're going to do the same to get the second integer input. So I'm going to use y in this case, get int y, and I'm going to print also, just for us to see if everything is running okay. Okay, so remember %i /n to go to another line after running the code, and here I have to declare the variable. So make problem1 and then /problem1. So for x we're going to use 1, and for y we're going to use 2. So it's running okay. When we get the input, it's printing, so we see this here, and when we get the int of y, it's printing again. So by now, so far so good, okay? So here I'm going to erase this part because it's not what the problem wants us to print, but I'm just using this for you to understand what's happening with the code. And I'm going to print here get inputs from user. Okay, now we have to do the second part of our problem, that is print which one of them is the largest. So now we have to compare x and y. Okay, so how are we going to do this? If we check here in the CS50 notes, we have the conditions where we can use the if and else blocks. Okay, so in this case we're going to use if to check if x is greater than y, or if y is greater than x, and also if x and y are equal. Okay, so let's do this. So when we're going to use if, we have to call if. Inside the parentheses we put the conditions that we are comparing. So in this case, x greater than y. If x is greater than y, what's inside this curly braces is what it's going to appear in our terminal if this condition is right. Okay, so it's going to printf x is greater than y. Okay, and we have to close with this semicolon. So this is the first condition, x greater than y. But we have two more conditions that our problem can have. So the other condition is y greater than x, right? So we're going to use else if. Remember, inside the parentheses we're going to use the condition. So x is less than y. And we're going to printf y is greater than x, right? And then we have our third case, that it's x is equal than I. But this third case we can use just else, because since that's the only case remaining, because if the x is not greater than y and it's not less than y, so they are equal, right? So we can just use else in this case, and it's going to printf x is equal to y. Okay, so let's see everything running okay. So let's check. Make problem1, so it's running. We don't have any problem with syntax, and then we're going to check here. So x equals 1, y equals 2, and y is greater than x. So far so good. Let's do this again. So x equals 2, y equals 1, x is greater than y. Perfect. And now let's check the last case. X equals 1, y equals 1, so x is equal to y. Okay, problem 2 of programming fundamentals. Okay, so let's read the problem. Print cough in 3 ways. First, using 3 printf statements, then using a loop, and then using a function. So first, we're going to do using 3 printf statements, okay? So remember, when we start writing our code, we have to set which libraries we're using in it, okay? So as the common library that we normally use is the stdio.h, so we're going to include this library in our problem, okay? So this is the first step. Now we have to call our main function, that it's the when green flag clicked block in the Scratch, okay? So we're going to call int main void, and remember we have to open and close the curly braces here. And now let's do the first way. So first, using 3 printf statements. And one thing is interesting for you to know is that the printf function is included in this library here, okay? So if we just write printf here without this include stdio.h, the compiler don't understand what he has to do with the printf. He doesn't understand what's the meaning of printf, okay? So this is the first, so we're just going to printf 3 times. Cough. So cough, we're going to call 3 times. So we're going to write 3 times printf cough and cough again. Okay. So let's run our code. So make problem 2. So far so good, no problems with our syntax. And problem 2. So here we see it coughs 3 times, right? But this is it's not a good way for us to do this, because if we want to increase this for 10, we would have to write 10 times cough, 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 cough. So this is not a good idea. So in order to do this, we have this second way. It's then using a loop. So let's do this then using a loop. Okay, I'm going to delete this part because we already know. Actually, I'm going to comment out because we already did this part. Okay, so now we're going to do the then using a loop. So now we're going to do using a for loop. Okay, so if we see here in the notes in the part of abstraction, we already did this meal printing 3 times. Okay, now we're going to do a for loop. So for loop, we have to use 3 inputs: where it starts the for loop, where it's going to stop, and how you're going to increment or decrement it. Okay, so in our case, as a convention, we always start on index equals 0, not index equals 1 as we normally use it in our live. So as programming, we have to always think as 0 as the first number. Okay, so here we declare the variable I as int equals 0, semicolon, where we're going to stop. So we have to do this 3 times. So we're going to do this in I equals 0, I equals 1, and I equals 2. So we want to I be less than 3, right? And we want to increment 1 unit in I. Then we have to open and close the curly braces, and here we're going to printf cough. Okay, so let's see what happens here. Make problem 2, so far so good. And then problem 2, it coughs 3 times. So what happened actually? In a for loop, we have to think as this way. The first iteration is going to be 1 equals 0, and the first 1 equals 0, it's going to print cough, right? Then here it's going to increment 1 in 0, so then we're going to I equals 1, so it's going to cough again. Then we're going to increment again because it didn't reach the number 3, so here 2, it's going to cough again, and then we're going to increment again, and we reach the number 3. So when we do this, the iteration stops. That's why we're just going to see 3 times the word cough in our terminal, okay? So this is using the for loop. I'm going to comment this out for us to do the last part. Actually, I'm going to erase now, okay? And what we're going to do, then using a function. We're going to use a function just for you to know how to define functions to use in the main function here, that it's the int main void. So first we're going to create the function. So remember, it's something that we have to do. This is something that it's how C language works. So we have to create the function after the int main. Okay, so here we create the function, and then we have to declare which type is this function. Okay, so in our case, we just want to return the word cough when we call this function. So this function has no type, so we use void. Okay, void, and then we can give a name for our function. I will give a name as cough. Okay, and then I'm going to use as input an int, and this int I'm going to call as I in here in this case. And then we have to open and close the curly braces, and we're going to write inside. So what we want to do in our function, we're going to do exactly what we do in the for loop. So we're going to do a for loop. So we're going to call int, I'm going to change it as x just to make things more clear. So the first input of our for loop is int I equals 0 because we're initializing our for loop. Then we're going to do I less than the x number here. Okay, and then we're going to increment. So what we're going to do inside of our for loop, we're going to print f cough this x times. Okay, so basically we're going to call a function called cough, and this function we have to pass as an input a number here, and this number, it's how many times we're going to print cough, because we're using here as the limit of our for loop this number x that we pass as an input. And one more thing we have to do after we create our function, we have to put this before our int main void. We just have to put the first line, for example, because when the compiler runs our program, it runs passing through line 1 and 2, the last line we have in our code. But if the compiler passes inside the int main void and doesn't understand what cough is, he's going to break and we're not going to succeed in our code. So in order to do this, in here we just explain to the compiler, oh, we have a function that we created after the main, and so whatever this function do, you have to know that you're going to find out after you run the int main part. Okay, so here we do void cough. We're going to write the same way, but here we have to close with the semicolon. Okay, so this is the structure, and now we have to call our function, right? Because if we run this way, nothing's going to happen because the program doesn't understand what we're doing. So if we run, nothing appears because we're not calling nothing we're not calling anything inside our main code, okay? So if we want to call, we just write cough, that it's the name of our function, and as we want to cough in 3 times, we're going to put here as input 3. Why? Because we just put the number 3 here because the function understands that this number here, it's an input because we already said this before. So let's run our program. And this coughs 3 times. I just forgot to use this backslash and to break the lines. So let's do this again. Compile and then run the code, and it coughs 3 times. If we want to cough 10 times, for example, we run our code again and it will cough 10 times because any number we put in here, it's going to enter as a limit in our for loop and it's going to do the iteration inside. Okay, third problem of programming fundamentals. So let's start reading the question. Ask user for 2 integer inputs, write a C function to return the sum of the 2 given integer values, but if the 2 values are the same, then return triple their sum. Print the result. So the idea here is to get from the user 2 integer inputs, right? And with these 2 integers, we're going to make a sum of them. And we're going to return this sum. But if the 2 values, if these 2 integers are the same, we're going to return the triple of their sum, okay? So let's start. So remember, as I talked before in the previous videos, we have to include the libraries that we're going to use in our code. So the main library that we normally use when we are using C language, we have to include the stdio.h. It's where we have the printf function, for example, okay? And then, so we're going to ask the user for 2 integer inputs, right? So remember in the CS50 notes, if we want to get integer from the user, we can use the CS50 library because there we have the getInt function and we can get the integer and store in variables, okay? So that's what we're going to do. So first we have to include also the library of CS50.h because it's where we're going to get the getInt function, right? And now we're going to start. So we're going to start writing our main code. So our main function using the int main void. Open and close the curly braces, and inside we're going to give the right indentation. And inside this main code, we're going to do the first step, that it's ask user for 2 integer inputs, right? So how we're going to do this? Remember what I said in the previous videos. We have to give the type of our variable, give a name for our variable, and then we're going to call the function getInt, where we're going to store this value here in this variable here, okay? So let's call our type is int because we want an integer. I'm going to call this variable as x. We're going to use the getInt, and here I'm going to pass what is going to appear in my terminal. What I write in here is what is going to appear in my terminal. Let's see if everything's running okay. And remember here, if we want to printf the value that we stored in the variable, we have to print a placeholder for an integer using the %i, followed by a new line, since we want to print out, in our case, just x, right? So we have to pass x for printf to substitute in the string here. So that's what we're going to do. So printf x is %i, We're going to jump one line, and here we have to say which variable we want to show in our placeholder here. Okay, let's save, make problem 3. Is everything running okay? Problem 3. So if we put x equals 5, so x is 5, so it's running okay by now. So now we're going to do this again because we want 2 integers as input, right? So the second integer I'm going to call y. So get int, I'm going to do exactly the same because we know this is working, and fine. So now let's do the second part. Write a C function to return the sum of the 2 given integer values. Now we're going to do where the most cases are going to go, okay? Because it's returning the sum of these 2 integers. This other part with but blah 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 we're going to see later, okay? So we have to create a function. So here again in the CS50 notes we have an explanation on how to create functions. So conventionally, our main function should be the first function in our program, right? As we saw in the previous video. So we need a few more lines. It turns out that we need to declare our function first with a prototype. That's what we saw before. We have to give this part here of our function, we have to put before the int main, because we want to explain the compiler that we create a function and he will understand while he compiles our code, okay? So the compiler reads our source code from top to bottom, so it needs to know that our function will exist later in the file, okay? So here we have to call our function to write the prototype. Inside the main code, we were going to call the function, and then we have to write what our function does, okay? So that's what we're going to do. So our function has type int, right? Because we're going to return an integer value. As we're going to return an integer value, our type of our function is int. I'm going to call this function as sum, okay? And we have as 2 integers, as the 2 inputs, the 2 integers that we got from the user. So here we have to declare the type of the inputs that we're going to take. So I'm going to put here like int x and int y, right? Then we have to open and close the curly braces, and inside we're going to write what we want to return. So we're going to do the default case that it's just return the sum, right? So we're going to return the sum of x and y, right? So this is the basic case where we just return the sum. And now we have to put this prototype before the int main function, right? So we put here, for example, it has to be before the int main and after the inclusion of the libraries. And we have to put the semicolon here in the end of the line. So far so good, but if we run this way, it's not going to return anything because we're not calling our function. I'm gonna show you. If we run our code, we're going to put here 5 and 4, and it's going to return nothing because we're not calling our function in the int main. Everything that is going to happen in our code has to be inside our int main, so in order to appear here in the terminal. So now we have to do this part. We're going to call the function, right? And how do we call the function? We just call the name and we put the inputs inside the parentheses. So our function is sum, and the inputs are our x and y, and we don't need to put here int x and int y because we already explained before here that our variables are integers, okay? So let's see how it goes. Clear, let's make problem 3, run our problem 3, 5, 5, And okay, I forgot one thing. If we want to return something, in this case, I'm sorry, in this case, we're just getting the value, but we're not going to appear in the terminal because we're not using printf, right? So we're going to store the value that this function returns in a variable. So I'm going to call a variable like int result, for example. And in int result variable, I'm going to store the value that the function sum passed to us, okay? And then we're going to print the result, right? So now print the result. Where I'm here to, even if I have some bugs, it's good for you to see what we can do when we are running our code and how we can debug this, right? And then, so we want to print, we're going to use the printf. So here I'm going to write the result is. Remember that we have to use the placeholder. In integers case, it's %i. And in here we have to declare which value this placeholder is holding. And in our case, it's the integer result. Okay, so now let's run. Clear. Make problem 3. Run problem 3. 5. 5. And the result is 10. So far so good. Now we've done the basic case, but if we see here, we have an if case, right? If the two values are the same, then we return triple their sum. So where we're going to do the if and else condition? Inside our function, right? So we have the default case, that is, we have our case here that it's the both values are the same, so two values are the same, it's going to return the triple, right? So the first case we're going to do is two values are the same. So if inside the parentheses we put the condition, if x equals y, what we're going to do inside, we're going to return, so it's the triple of the sum, right? So we're going to do the sum here, and we're going to multiply by 3, right? This way. Don't forget to use the semicolon then. And else, we're going to return what we were returning in the previous moment. Okay, so give the right indentation and this way. So let's run our code and see how it goes. So make problem 3, run problem 3, so 5, so the result is 30. Why? Because the two inputs are the same, then it returns the triple, right? Now let's see the other case. We're going to run again. 1 and 2, it's going to return 3, right? Now we're going to do the problem 4 of programming fundamentals. And first we're going to read the question. So ask the user for two integer inputs, write a C function to compute return true if one of them is 30 or if their sum is 30. Printf the result. So first of all, as I said before, we have to include the libraries, right? I'm going to pass this part faster because I already explained this better in the previous videos, but basically we have to call the libraries that we're going to use, and stdio, it's the main library that we use when we are coding on C language, okay? And in the ask user for two integers, we're going to use the CS50 library, right? Where we have the getInt function. So we have to include the CS50 library here, right? After we call the libraries, we have to create our main function, that it's the int main void, and we have to open and close the curly braces. Inside, we're going to do now the first case, right? So ask user for 2 integer inputs, right? So we already saw this. We have to use the getInt function. So we're going to create a variable, and then we have to give a type. In our case, it's int. Give a name for this variable and store the value of the getInt function in this variable here. So we're going to call int x because our type is an integer, getInt, and here it's what's going to appear in the terminal, right? Let's printf here just to check if our code is running okay. And remember, in this case we're going to use a placeholder to show the value of the variable x, and in here we have to declare which variable this placeholder is holding, right? So let's run make problem 4 dot / problem 4. So x equals 4, so x is 4, so it's running okay. We're going to do the same again because we want 2 integers, right? So I'm creating a new variable and calling the function getInt, right? So we know this is running okay. Now we have to write a C function to compute return true if one of them is 30 or if their sum is 30. So remember, when we're creating a function, conventionally our main function should be the first function in our program, right? So we need a few more lines. It turns out that we need to declare our function, our created function, first with a prototype before we use it in main and actually define it after. The compiler reads our source code from top to bottom, so it needs to know that our created function will exist later in the file, right? So we're going to create a function. I don't know, we can create a test function, for example. And in our case, we're going to return true or false. But it's interesting for you to search on Google that, like in C, the integer 0 represents false and 1 represents true, right? So in our case, we're going to return 1 or 0. So our function has to be with type int, right? Because it's going to return or 1 or 0. The name of our function, I will give a name as test, and we are going to pass as input the 2 integers that we get from the user. So here we're going to get int x and int y, right? So what we're going to do, the idea here is to do the second part, that is write a C function to return true, blah blah blah, right? But we know that, so we want to return true if one of them is 30 or if their sum is 30, right? So in our part, in our function, we're going to return these 3 cases where x is equal to 30, or this is a mark for or, okay, or I is equal to 30, or their sum it's equal to 30, right? We're going to return just this. This is what we want our function do. To compute return true if one of them is 30 or if their sum is 30. So this is what we're doing. In this case, if this case is true, it's going to return 1, right? Because we saw here that 1 represents true in C language. And if none of these cases it's filled in, so it's going to return 0, okay? Remember, when we create a function, we have to put the prototype before the main function, so we have to put in here. after the inclusion of the libraries and before the int main void. So we're going to put exactly the first line we have in here. So int test, int x, int y, and we have to close our line with a curly braces, okay? Now that we've done this, we have to call our function inside the main function. That's how we're going to use this function in our code. Because I don't know if you saw the previous video. If we just run this, it's not going to return anything because this is not being called in the main function, okay? Everything that is going to appear in the terminal has to be called in the main function. So now we're going to do this. So first we have to store the value of test in a variable. So in this case, since we're going to return 1 or 0, our variable has to be an integer type, right? So int result equals our test, and we're going to pass as input the x and y that we get from the user here, okay? So we just need to put x and y because we already said that these both variables are integers, and we already have these values, okay? And then we have to print the result. And how we're going to print? We use the printf, and we're going to see that the result is, remember we have to use the placeholder when we want to see the value of our variable, and here we have to call which variable is this placeholder holding, okay? So what's going to happen? If this case here happens, this is going to return 1 because it's true, right? True in C language. If this case it's not, if the numbers that we put here doesn't match this if condition, it's going to return 0, that it's the false, return 0, that it's the false case, okay? So let's check what happens with our problem. So make problem 4. Something is missing in our case here. Oh, right, we have to close the return with a semicolon. So let's run it again. Make problem 4. So nothing, with no errors with the compiling part. And let's run problem 4. So first we're going to see the 3 ways of having this if condition true, right? So first of all, x being 0 and y being any number. So the result is 1. In our case, the result 1, it's true. So our problem so far, it's everything working all right, okay? Now we're going to see with y being 30, so in x we can give any number, and y being 30, and what happens? The result is 1, so it's true. Our condition is still fine. And then the other conditions that we have is if the x and y, the sum of x and y, it's 30. So I'm going to put 15, 15, and the result is 1, true, because the sum of 15 plus 15 is 30, okay? And now we're going to see when it will return false, that it's when none of these cases are filled in with the x and y numbers that we give as input. So for example, x5, y4, for example, so the result is 0. Problem 5 of Programming Fundamentals. So let's see the problem. Write a C program to find the sum of the number from 1 to 10 using for loops. Okay, so the idea is use for loop to do the sum of the number from 1 to 10. So we're going to sum 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4, so on and so forth until 10, okay? So as we know, as we saw in the previous videos, we have to put the header file, that's our library, and also we have to create the main function here, right? So we're going to start using the hash include stdio.h, that it's our main library, right? Where we have the for loops, we have the printf, and these things that we're going to use in this problem. And since we don't have to take any integer from the user as we were doing before, so we're just going to use this library, okay? Then we have to start our main function, so we create the int main void, and we're going to run our problem inside this main function, right? So we want to find the sum, right? So first of all, we have to create a variable called sum to do the iteration while we are incrementing the numbers from 1 to 10. So we're going to create the int, so it's type int because result, as we're going to increment 1 to 10, we're just using integers, right? So we're going to create a variable called result, and we're going to initialize as 0. Okay, and now we're going to do a for loop. We have a for loop explanation in our CS50 notes. Okay, so we have a lot of ways to do a loop. In this case, we have while, but in our problem, we're going to use the for loop. Okay, we already saw this before, right? So the first input, we are initializing a variable. Then we're going to give the limit of this variable where our for loop is going to end, and then we give the condition of how we want this variable to be manipulated. So in this case, it's incrementing 1 unit in this variable here. Okay, so what we're going to do is, so we're going to create the for, right? So the first input is to start a variable where we're going to start our for loop. So in our case, we're going to start with int equals 1. Why? Because we want to sum the number from 1 to 10, right? So we're going to initialize in I equals 1. Then we want to increment from 1 to 10. So our limit of our for loop is going to be the number 10, okay? So we're going to do this, I less than or equal to 10, okay? We could do this way or we could do this way here, right? But I'm going to use 10 because I think it's more understandable. And then we're going to increment this variable here in each iteration, okay? Then we have to open and close the curly braces. And what we're going to do, we're going to do the sum in each iteration here. So we're going to manipulate the value of result. So in here, we're going to do result equals the previous value of the result. So the previous value in the first case will be 0. And then we're going to sum with the variable that is incrementing in here. So we're going to do plus I, okay? So what is going to happen? In the first iteration, I is equals 1, so result will be 0 plus 1, right? Then I is going to be 2, and we're going to be result equals 1, that was the previous result, plus 2, and then we're going to be 3. And this we're going to do the for loop until I is equal to 10, okay? And then we want to print the result of the sum. So we're going to do a printf, okay? So the sum is, we have to use the placeholder when we are when we want to share the value of the variable. And in this case, we're going to use a /n to give a space of line. And here we have to specify which variable this placeholder is holding. So the variable is result, right? Because this is what we want in the end. So let's see if our code is running okay. So make problem 5, right? And we're going to run the code, and then I'm going to use the debug 50 in order to understand what is happening in our code, okay? So now let's run the code, and we're going to have the result as 55. That's what is expected, okay? But now we're going to do debug, use the debug 50. So we're going to click in here to put in a breakpoint in one line in our code, and then we were going to see what's happening, okay? So here we put in our terminal debug 50 and the name of our file, that it's problem 5. And now it's going to appear this for us, and we're going to use the step over to reach here. So if we see the terminal did run the code until this line 9 where we put our breakpoint, and before I is explained for what is the value of I, the terminal gives any number for us, any value for this variable I, because by now he doesn't understand that I is equal to 1 because he didn't run this part here of the code, okay? So let's do the step into to see what happened. So now it's our first iteration where I is equal to 1, and by now result is equal to 0 because we didn't do the iteration. So let's check. Now we're on line 11, we're going to run the line 11, and we see that in the first iteration with I equals 1, the result was 1 because before was 0, and 0 plus 1 it's 1, okay? We see here. Now we go to step over, and we're going to see that I is equal to 2 now because we're doing the second iteration, and now the result changed because we had here result as 1 before plus 2, and then it become 3. Now we're going to interact again. I is equal to 3, and our result becomes 6 because before result was 3 and plus 3 becomes 6. Okay, next iteration, I is equal to 4, and now we sum 4 to 6. That was the previous result in here. And then we keep interacting. So we see here I is equal to 5, and the result become 15. And if we do the step into a lot of times, we're going to see what's happening inside the for loop. Okay, so I hardly recommend for you to do this by yourself in order to understand better how to use the debug 50 and to understand better how iteration works. Okay, problem 6 of programming fundamentals. So first of all, let's read the question. Write a C program to check if two integers are in the range 100 to 200 inclusive. So what's the idea? We're going to take two integers. In this case, he didn't specify that we have to take these two integers from the user, so we're just going to choose some numbers for our test, okay? And we're going to see if these two integers are in the range that he gives in here, okay? So first of all, remember, I'm going to say this in all videos, we have to put the header file, our library that we're going to use in our code. So remember, in C language, the main library that we use is the stdio, right? And then we have to create our main function, okay? It's where our program is going to run. So int main void, and give the right indentation here, okay? Now, as a different way to do this problem, we could solve this problem inside the main function, but I'm here to teach you different ways of doing it, right? So I'm going to do it in a harder way first, where we're going to create a function, okay? So what we're going to do, we're going to create a function to test, we're going to pass as input the two integers, and we're going to check if one of them are, if both of them are inside of this range here, okay? So first I'm going to create the function. So remember, in CS50 notes, main function should be the first function in our program, so it's always the first function that is going to run. But we have, if we're going to create a new function, we have to declare this function first with a prototype. So we're going to do this before the main function and after the inclusion of the library. And we're going to define what this function does before, after the main function, okay? Because remember, the compiler reads our source code from top to bottom, so it needs to know that our created function exists, okay? So we're going to create a function. In our case, it's going to return a number. It's going to return true or false. And remember, in C language, 1 it represents true and 0 represents false, okay? So we're going to return 1 or 0, and this is going to say to us if it's going to check if these two integers are in the range, okay? One of them are in this range. So we're going to create a function int, because we're going to return 1 or 0, and I'm going to give a name as test to our function. And then we want as input for this function these two integers that we're going to check. So we're going to pass int x and int y, right? And inside the curly braces, we're going to do what this function is going to return. So it's going to return, first we're going to do the first case, x is greater than or equal to 100, or and this double E, different symbol of E here, represents and, okay? So x has to be greater than 100 and less than 200, okay? Actually, less or equal than, right? And then we're going to use the OR here. This represents OR in C language, because we want to check if x is inside this range, or y is inside this range, or both of them, okay? And then we're going to do OR I is greater or equal than 100 and y is less or equal than 200, right? Don't forget to close. And we have to put this prototype before the main function. So we're going to write the first line of our function. Sorry, I write this wrong. Test int x, int y, and we're going to close with a semicolon, okay? As I said in a previous video, if we run our code this way, it's not going to appear anything, because we're not calling our function in the int main void function here, because everything that is going to happen in our code has to be called inside of this function, okay? It's the main function, as this name says. So as we don't get the two integers from the user, we're going to printf any three tests that we want to check, okay? So printf, remember to put the placeholder for the first, to placeholder the value of our variable, okay? And in this case, we're going to call our variable inside the printf function. So instead of creating a variable to store the value that this function here creates, we're going to just call the function inside here, because this function already will give us a value, and this value is being holding with this placeholder here, okay? So test, let's put two inputs here. So 100 and 199. We're going to do 2 more tests. Printf %i. Now another test. 250 and 300. And printf I, and a third test is 105 and yes. Okay, so let's run our code. Make problem 6. No errors with syntax. Problem 6, let's run it. So here we see what? 1, remember, 1 represents true. So I'm going to put here as comment. Okay, so you don't forget. 1 represents true, 0 false. Okay, so in the first case it's true. These integers are in the range of 100 and 200 inclusive. The second represents false because these numbers are far from 200, and the third is 1 because these numbers are inside of this range here. This is the problem 7 of programming fundamentals. So the question is, ask user for integer input, print if input is even or odd. So first of all, we have to include the library that we're going to use. Okay, I'm going to pass this part faster because I already said this before in the previous videos. Okay, and now this is the standard library that we normally use for C program, but as we have to ask user for integer input, we're going to use the getInt that is inside the CS50 library. Okay, so we're going to include cs50.h, that it's the CS50 library, and now we're going to start our main function. Okay, so inside the main function, let's do the first part, that is ask user for integer input. So this is a comment in order to understand what we're doing. Okay, and now we're going to write our first line of code. So we want to ask user for integer input. So in this case, we're going to create a variable with type int because it's integer. Okay, I'm going to call x in this case, and we're going to store in this variable the value that we're going to get by the getInt function. Okay, so this part inside of the parentheses is what is going to appear in the terminal. And since the user place a number to this x, it's going to store in this variable x here. Okay, so let's check. Printf, we have to use the placeholder, okay, when we want to print the value of a variable, and then we have to declare which variable we are storing in this placeholder here. So let's check. Make problem 7, so no problem with the syntax, and let's run problem 7. So x5 and returns 5 for us, so it's working. Okay, let me zoom in so you can see better the code. So now we're going to do the next part, that is print if input is even or odd. Okay, so for this we're going to use the if and else condition, right? So if something happens, it's going to print even, and else it's going to print odd. Okay, so how we're going to do this if and else part? So we have to use the if. Okay, it's in CS50 notes. Okay, you can check it later. And inside the if, we're going to create, we have to give a condition, right? So how can we check if an integer is even or odd? So what we're going to do is use this % here, that it's for reminder. So we're going to do, the reminder is what? In a division, it's the remainder of this division, okay? So if the remainder is equal 0, so for example, if we divide, let's see here. So if we divide 2 by 2, what we're going to have as remainder? So the result is 1, right? And the remainder, it's going to be what? 0, right? So this is the idea. If we do this with another number, so 4 divided by 2 is equals 2, and the remainder is what? Is 0, okay? So we're going to check if the input it's even by doing this, taking this remainder here. So how do we take the remainder? We're going to use this % here, right? Because it's one mathematical operator that we can use when we are doing the C language. So check it out later, this part of operators, limitations, and truncation, okay? But more this part here. So now we're going to do the condition. If the integer x is equal, the integer x, the remainder of the integer x by 2 is equal to 0. So what we're doing, so think of x being 2. So the remainder of 2 divided by 2 is 0. So it's even, okay? We're going to print even. And the else condition, because a number can just be even or odd, so the else condition, it's going to print odd. Okay? So that's the idea. So let's check. So make problem 7. So it's running okay. Problem 7. So let's check. Let's give a number of 4. So it's even, right? Because 4 divided by 2, it's 2, and there's no remainder. The remainder is 0. So it's going to be even, right? Let's do this code again, and now with 5. So it's going to print odd. Why? Because 5 divided by 2, it's 2, and the remainder is 1. So it's going to print odd, okay? Now let's put a breakpoint to check how our code works, okay? So debug 50 problem 7, and we can see what's happening in our code. So let's do this step into. So first we have to put a number, so for example 7, okay? Now we see here x is equal to 7, and it's going to pass in the first condition. So 7 here, as 7 divided by 2, the remainder is 1, so it's not going to be in this part of the condition, so it goes directly to the else part, okay? And then it's going to print odd for us, okay? Problem 8 from Programming Fundamentals, okay? So first of all, let's read the question. Ask user for integer input, which will be our change. Use a while loop to determine how many quarters will be given as change. So the idea is we're going to ask the user an amount of $, for example, and with this we're going to do a while loop to know how many quarters. So a quarter is what? It's one, it's 25 cents, right? So we're going to return our change with 25 cents. So we have to do this iteration to know how many quarters will be given as change, okay? So first of all, we have to include our libraries. So the first one, that it's the one that we're going to use every time that we are running C language, is the stdio.h, okay? And since we want to ask user for integer input, we're going to use the CS50 library. So we're going to use we have to include the cs50.h also. And we're going to start our main function, okay? So the first part is ask user for integer input. So I'm going to write here as comment, okay? Ask user for integer input. And how do we do this? So we already know, because in the past problems we did this. So we're going to create a variable. In this case, I'm going to create a variable with type int, okay? And I'm going to call this variable as x. And in this variable, I'm going to store the value that I'm going to get by the getInt, okay? The getInt function that CS50 have included. So I'm going to write here a different message that is going to appear in the terminal in order to the user understands what he has to put when running this code, okay? So we're going to write what's your change, okay? So this is the message that is going to appear in our terminal. So let's check. By now we're going to do make problem 8, and we're going to run problem 8, and you see it's going to appear this message here, and then we're going to type something. In this case I type 5 and nothing happens because we're not doing anything with this variable, okay? And now we're going to the next part, that is what? Use a while loop to determine how many queries will be given as change, okay? So, as you can see here in lecture 1 notes, it's nice for you to check it out later. This part of Boolean expression loops, okay, that explains better how a while loop works. So basically, we're going to initialize a variable, and in the while loop, what appears here inside the parentheses is the condition to stop this while. So it's nice for us to initialize a variable here, and then we give a limit of how many times we want this while to happen. And inside we're going to manipulate this variable to increment in this case, because if you see, this while loop wants to return, wants to print hello world less than 50 times, right? So each iteration is going to increment I, and then it's going to change I until it reaches here 50. And when it reaches 50, it's going to stop the while and stop the code, okay? So that's the idea that we're going to do. So later take a look at this and you're going to understand better the idea. So it's basically the same idea as doing for loop, but in this case we're going to do a while loop, okay? So let's do this in here. So first of all, we're going to initialize a variable. Since here we have, but this initialized variable, it's the one that it's going to return to us how many changes we have to give, okay? So we're going to create an int called count of quarters, okay? And we're going to initialize it 0 because we want to count how many we're going to give as change. So by now we're going to return 0. We're going to know how many we're going to return when we do this while loop that we're going to do now, okay? So we don't need to create this I here because we're going to use our x variable as this limit to our while loop, okay? So let's start while. And what we want to do, while x is greater than 25, we're going to do this while loop here, because the idea is to each iteration we're going to take out 25 units from x, okay? So this information here it's the same thing as we do this. So this is the same thing as we say doing this, okay? So in each iteration we're going to take 25 units from the variable x, and while this variable x is greater than 25, we're going to do this while loop, okay? And in each iteration, we're going to increment 1 unit for count of quarters, okay? So the idea is, in each iteration, we're going to increment this variable and decrement the x variable by 25, okay? So count of quarters. Explaining seems kind of confusing, but you're going to see that it's not, okay? While we do the debug 50, you're going to understand. So after this, we're going to printf how many quarters we want to give as change. So we're going to printf this variable here, okay? Remember to use the placeholder. In this case, it's an integer, so we're going to use I or D. And we have to say to the compiler which value this placeholder is holding. So it's count of quarters, okay? So let's see if our program has some problem. No, it's running okay. And first, before running the code, we're going to do the debug 50 because I think it gets clearer to understand what's happening, okay? Problem 8. So let's see. Yes, I forgot to put a breakpoint, so I'm going to put this in here, okay? So we're going to understand what's happening. So put a breakpoint somewhere, and now we're going to check what's happening in here. So this is our code. So let's do a step into. So the code already runs into this line here, and it already passed what's your change. So our change will be by now 100, okay? So let's see. The first thing that happens here, so they created already the count of quarters, and by now it's 0, value 0, and our x has value 100. So since x has value 100, it's greater than 25, so it's going to happen our while loop, okay? Now let's see what happens. So do a step into, we see this line. So our x was 100 and now it's 75 because here we did this minus operation, okay? And our count of quarters by now it's 0, but it's going to increment 1 value. So this was the first iteration. Now we're going to do the next iteration. So come back to line 14. Since our x is 75, it's going to happen our while loop again because it's greater than 25, right? Can you see here? 75. So we're going to do a step into, so it's working our while loop again. Now our x become 50, right? Because we did this line 16, and now our count will increment, okay? So we did the second iteration. Now we're going to check again if our condition here inside the while loop is true. So x is 50 and 50 is greater than 25, so it's going to happen again our loop, our iteration. So now our x become 25 because we took out 25 in this line, and now it's going to increment 1. So count of quarters is going to be 3. And now we're going to iterate again. Let's check the while loop. So 25, it's not greater than 25, it's equal. So it's going to stop our while loop, and then it's going to print how many quarters, okay? And it's 3, right? So in this case, we just forgot one thing. That is, it has to be greater or equal, right? I think I forgot to explain this. So let's do the debug 50 again, because if we get 25, we can do again x minus 25, and it's going to become 0, and a quarter has value as 25, so it's okay, we use the equal here, okay? So let's do this again. I have to recompile, so make problem. We have to recompile because we did the problem again, and now let's do we have to recompile because we changed the code, okay? So now let's do this again. So what's your change? I'm going to put 101. Actually, I'm going to put less, so 51. So we enter in our while loop because 51 is greater than 25, and here we're going to take, so you can see here count is 0 and x is 51. Now when we do the step into on line 16, we're going to take out 25 and it's going to become 26, and it's going to increment the count, okay? Now it's going to check again the condition in the while loop, so 26 is greater than 25, so it's going to happen our iteration again. So now we took out 25 and we have x equals 1, and we're going to increment our count. So now we have count 1. Now in this line it's going to check, so x has value 1 and x it's not greater or equal than 25, so it's going to stop our while loop, and then we're going to print. Okay, the problem 9 of programming fundamentals. So the question is, create a function. This function should return the user input only if it is positive. Use the while, keep looping until user inputs positive value. So the idea is we're going to create a function. Okay, so we're going to create a function out of the main function, and we have to call this function that we created in the main function, okay? And then we're going to use the getInt, right? Because we want to get an integer from the user, right, as input. And we're going to do this until the user give us a number that is positive. So we're going to use the do while. So first of all, let's start our code, and then I'm going to explain the things that we're going to use, okay? So first, remember, we have to include the libraries that we're going to use. So we're going to include the standard library, that is the stdio. And since we're going to get from the user an input, we have to use the CS50 library, right? So remember the getInt function that we're going to use. And then we're going to start our main function. So get main int main void, and by now we're going to do the function, okay, our created function. So remember from CS50 notes, our main function should be the first function in our program, okay? So we need a few more lines. So it turns out that we need to declare our created function first with a prototype, so here, this way, before we use it in main, and actually define it after. So we have to call it first, like a prototype, then we have to call this function inside the main function, and we're going to describe what this main function does, this created function does after. Because the compiler reads our source code from top to bottom, so it needs to know that our created function will exist later in the file, okay? So this is the first step that we're going to do. So we want to return, what we want to return? So we want to return the number that the input gives to us. So the type of our function is an int, okay? I'll give a name this function as get positive int, okay? And we're going to have as input of this function nothing, so we're going to write void, okay? Because we're going to get the user input inside this function that we created, okay? Remember, we have to put a prototype before the main function and after the inclusion of the library. So we're going to basically copy this part here, okay? We're going to paste in here, basically, and we have to put our semicolon here, okay? So this is the first part of creating a function. Now we're going to do the do while part. So let's see here. The do while, with a do while loop, our program will do something first, then check some condition, and repeat while the condition is true. Okay, so a while loop, on the other hand, will check the condition first. So this is the difference between while and do while loop. So check it out later in the CS50 notes, okay? It's all in lecture 1. So we're going to do the same. So first, we're going to initialize a variable. And in this variable, we're going to initialize just the type, okay? Because we want our program to understand that we want to create a variable with type int, but we're not going to store any value by now. And then, in the do while loop, we're going to use this variable to get the int from the user, okay? So, now we're going to do, see this structure, we use do blah blah blah, the condition, and then we use the while with the condition of the while loop, okay? So now we're going to write do. On the next line, we're going to open and close the curly braces, and inside these curly braces, we're going to write what? We're going to take the variable that we created in here, okay? And we're going to store the value of getInt, and this getInt function we already know from the other exercises. So positive integer, this is what is going to appear in the terminal, okay? So we want this to happen while the user don't give us the number that it's greater than 0, okay? So we want the number to be positive. So while n it's less than 1, we want to do this thing here. So the idea is it's going to appear first, when we run our code, it's going to appear first this message in positive integer. The user is going to put a number, and then we're going to check if this number is greater than 1. If not, it's going to do this again, and we're going to stay inside this loop until the user gives us a number greater than 1, okay? So let's save it. And now we have to call this created function inside our main function, because if we don't do this, nothing is going to appear in our terminal, because we're not, everything that it's going to appear in our terminal and everything that we run in our code has to be inside the main function. So we're going to create a variable, okay, to store the value that we're going to get from this function here. So positive int, and we're not going to put anything inside because the input of our function is empty, it's null, okay? And then we're going to print the value of our integer, that is the value of our function, okay? So we're going to do this, right? So we have to use a placeholder to hold the value of our variable here, okay? So let's compile, so make problem 9. So we have one problem, let's see. So the problem is in the line 25, let me see. Does not return a value, right? So we're not returning anything in here, right? That's the problem. So the code is telling us that since we use here int, so we have to return something, and we're not returning. So that was my mistake. So we have to return the value of n, right? In order to get here this value of n, and then we're going to print. So we're going to return n, okay? Let's clear this, and let's see, make problem 9. So now we have no problems, and we're going to use the debug 50, okay? So I'm going to put a breakpoint in here, and now we're going to check, okay? So it gets more clear what we're doing. So debug 50 problem 9, it's going to appear here. So let's check, okay? So we see here that our code ran until 20, so now we're on line 22. So it's appearing here. Let's go step into. So appear here in our terminal, positive integer. So I'm going to put -1. Okay, so it stores the value n equals -1, and now we go to the while line. And what happens? So since n it's less than 1, so we're going to do the do again, the do part of the do while again. So did you see? So since this condition is not satisfied, it comes back again to the do part, okay? And appears again this. So I'm going to put 0 and it's going to happen the same thing. So it's doing this condition, so 0 is less than 1, yes, so it's going to do this again, okay? So it's going to check again our code and appears here as positive integer. Now I'm going to put 3, for example, and go to the while and check 3 is less than 1. No, so it's going to stop our while, okay? And then it's going to pass the value of n to the return, and this return is going to get here, okay? So this number that we pass here in the function is going to be stored in this variable here, and then did you see here I is equals 3, that is the number that we pass in the function, and now we're going to print it, okay? Problem 10 of Programming Fundamentals, and this is the question. Write a C program to check which number nearest to the value 100 among two given integers. Return 0 if the two numbers are equal. So, what's the problem? We're going to get two integers from the user, so we're going to use what? We're going to use the getInt from CS50 library, right? Something that we already used in the previous problems. And we're going to check which number is the nearest to the value of 100. So we're going to do some mathematical operation to check which of those two are the nearest, and then we're going to return 0 if the two numbers are equal, or we're going to return the value of the number if this number is the nearest, okay? So let's start. First we have to include the libraries that we are going to use. So stdio.h is the standard library, and we have to include the cs50.h because we're going to use the getInt, okay? So in this problem, Rodrigo, so in this case, actually, we're not going to get two integers from the user, right? So we're not going to use the cs50.h, my mistake. So in this problem, we created a solution that we want to do with a function that we are going to create, okay? So what we're going to do? So we're going to start with the main function, okay? And we're going to create a function to solve our problem. So by now, remember, our main function should be the first function in our program, and we have to declare our created function first with a prototype before we use it in main, and then we have to define it after, okay? So check it out later in the CS50 notes, and we're going to do this. So since we're going to return 0 or the number that we are checking that is the nearest to the value 100, we're going to return an integer with this function, right? So we're going to use the type int to define our new function. So the function I'm going to give a name as test, and as input we're going to take two numbers. So we're going to take two integers. I'm going to use in here, so int x and int y, okay? Remember, we have to write this after the include stdio.h and before the int main void with a semicolon in the end of the line, okay? So by now we declare our function, and now we're going to work with the problem. So we want to check which number is the nearest to the value of 100, okay? So what we're going to do? We're going to take the number. So for example, in this case, I'm going to create a variable, so int val equals. We're going to do an operation in here, so we're going to take the number x and we're going to do this minus 100, so we're going to get a number, okay? And we're going to do the same with the second value, I minus 100. The one that has the greater number, so for example, if we have, I'm going to show you here. So if we have x equals 1 and y equals 99, when we do x minus 100, what are we doing? So we're doing 1 minus 100, right? And what's the value that we're going to get? Minus 99. And if we do in this case here, sorry, let me just make this right. And if we do the same thing in here, so y minus 100 is equal to 99 minus 100. And what is the value that we get? Minus 1, right? If we think in absolute value, what number is the nearest to 100? It's 99, right? Because the distance between 99 and 100, it's 1. And in this case of x, the distance from 100 is 99, okay? So that's one thing that we have to have in mind. But, so in this case, we're going to have these values as return with a minus. But we don't want to get this minus, we want to get the absolute value. So we're going to use this int abs, that it's a function that we're going to get from a library that it's going to return to us the absolute value of int that we want, okay? So first we have to include this new library in the beginning of our code. So include, the name of the library is stdlib.h, okay? So this library is going to give us the abs function. And with the abs function, what is going to happen? So with the abs function, we're going to get the absolute value. So if we did this in here, abs blah blah blah, we're going to get abs blah blah blah, and then we're going to get the absolute value that it's going to become what? 99. So the absolute value is going to turn the negative value in positive, and the positive value is going to be to continue being positive, okay? So this is just a way to make everything in absolute value so we can do the conditions, right? So with these informations in our hand, we're going to do the if and else conditions. So the first condition that we're going to do is to check if both of these values here are the same, okay? So we're going to do if val equals val2, what we're going to return. So return 0 if the two numbers are equal. So here return 0, okay? And the else, it's if there are both different, okay? And now inside this else, we're going to do another if and else condition. But now we're going to check which one are the nearest to the value of 100, okay? So the first condition is first if val is less than val2, what it's going to return? It's going to return x, okay? So if this value here it's less than this value, so the integer x, it's nearest to 100, okay? It's the idea of x equals 1 and y equals 99. In this case, it's equals, sorry. So in this case, it's x equals 99 and y equals 1. So since the val here is equals 1, and the val2 in this case, it's 99. So what's going to be? If val it's less than 99, so what this means? This means that x it's nearest to 100, okay? So that's why we're going to return x. And the other case, it's the opposite. So we're going to do else return y, okay? So, okay, we create the function, but now we have to call this function inside our main code. So here we're going to do 3 tests just to check if our code is running. So the first one we're going to printf, and in here we're going to use to store in this placeholder the value that we're going to take in here. So the first value, we're calling the function inside, and we're going to put two numbers in here, so 78, 95. We're going to do this again, but we're going to change numbers, okay? We're going to do 3 tests, but we're going to change the numbers that are inside. So let's see, more 2 tests. So 99, 99, and in here 99 and 70, okay? So let's compile, make problem 10, so everything good, and debug 50, problem, oh, I have to put a breakpoint in here, so I'm going to put in the first if, okay? So let's run and let's check. So what's happening? So we have in this first case, so it's getting x equals 78, okay, it's in this first case here, x equals 78 and y equals 95. So the absolute value of this difference here is 22, and the absolute value of this difference here is 5. So it's going to check first if these both values are the same, and since it's not, it's going to pass to else. Then it's going to check these two conditions here. So if val is less than val 2, that it's not the case, it's going to go to the next else, okay? And then it's going to return y, right? So now you see here, return the number that it's the nearest, that it's 95, not 78. Now it's going to do the same, so it passes val. Let's just go forward. So pay it here, the first difference here in absolute value is 5, and the second one it's 5 too, because these both numbers are the same. And then it's going to check the first else, so it's checking if both are the same. Since they are the same, it's going to return 0, and it's going to appear here 0, okay? And then the third test, it's going to check, it's going to get the value of the both numbers, okay? So we have here the val of 1, that it's 99 here, so it's 1. And in here, in the second, it's 70, so the val 2 is 30, okay? And it's going to check. So if they are the same, it's going to return 0, but since they are not, it's going to go to the inner if and else that have inside this else here. So it's going to return x because this first val is less than the second, and it's going to return in here in our terminal 99. And then we finish to run our code, okay? The problem 11 from Programming Fundamentals, okay? And the problem is, write a C program to check if two given integers have the same last digit. So how are we going to do this? We're going to get two integers and we're going to check, okay, if they have the same last digit. So while we do the program, I'm going to explain what's the idea, okay? So first, remember, we have to include the standard library that it's stdio.h, okay? And we're going to call our main function, right? We're going to do a function, we're going to create a new function to do this thing, this check part, okay? So since we want to return if the two integers have the same last digit, we're going to return 1 if it's true and 0 if it's false. So remember, these two numbers are conventional from programming, okay? So since we're going to return 1 or 0, our function has to be the type integer, okay? And then we're going to give a name. In our case, I'm going to use x, and I'm going to use as input two integers, right? That it's the two integers that we're going to check. Now, the idea is, I don't know if you remember division, but here I have an example of what we're going to do. So let's see, if we have as dividend a number as 11, we're going, and a divisor, the number 2, if we divide 11 by 2, we're going to have as quotient 5, okay, because 2 multiplied by 5, it's 10. As a reminder, we're going to have the number 1, okay? So how we're going to check if the last digits are the same? We're going to use this reminder here, okay? And the reminder, we're going to use this symbol here, that it's the appropriate symbol to reminder in C language. So check this out in CS50 notes, okay? So we're going to return, the idea is we're going to get the number x. So x equals 5, for example. We're going to divide by 10, so let's take here 50, right? So we're going to divide by 10. So 50 divided by 10, what's the remainder here? It's 0, and the quotient is 1. It's 5, right? Because 5 multiplied by 10, it's 50, and we have no remainder. And we're going to take another number, so I don't know, 60 divided by 10. So the quotient here is 6, right? Because 6 multiplied by 10 is 60, and the remainder is 0. So we're going to check this. We're going to check the remainder if they have the same remainder. So they have the same last digit, okay? So here we have the same last digit. So if we do like this, 51 and 61, it's the same idea, but now the remainder is 1, and here the remainder is 1, okay? So that's the idea we're going to do. So in this case, here, in our code, we're going to return x remainder of 10, of another division of 10, okay? And if this number is equals to I, the remainder of I divided by 10, okay? But we can have a number here that is negative, so we're going to use the absolute value in here that we get from this library, stdlib, okay, that returns the absolute value of the integer that we want. So that we're going to use in here, okay? So abs, okay, and we have to include the library that we are using in this case, the stdlib.h, okay? So that's the idea. It's going to return 1 if these both reminders here are the same, and it's going to return 0 if these two reminders are not the same, okay? So for example, if we have in here, let me take this out, let me erase here. So if we have here 25, and in this case 27, okay? So dividing 25 by 10, we're going to have as quotient 2, because 2 multiplied by 10, it's 20, okay? And as reminder, it's the number that we have as reminder. So for example, this part here, okay? The reminder. So what we're going to have, it's 5 in this case, okay? And in the next case, what we're going to have? So 27 divided by 10, we're going to have 2, okay? But what's the remainder? It's 7, right? Because 2 multiplied by 10 is 20, and we have 27 here, so 27 minus 20, it's 7, and that's the remainder, okay? So that's the idea that it's going to have. So since here, these both reminders are not the same, it's going to return 0, so representing that this is false. But if they are both reminders are the same, it's going to return 1, and this represents true, okay? So now that we create our function, we have to put the prototype in here before the main function. So int test, int x, int y, and we have to close with the semicolon. And now we're going to do 3 tests in here to check if our function is working. So remember, we have to put a placeholder, and this placeholder is holding the value that we're going to get from the test function. So let's put here some examples. Okay, these examples are in the solution, so then check it out. This is another placeholder. We're going to do 3 tests. Okay, so tests with these new numbers. 3, no, we're going to do 4 tests. This way, actually we're going to do 2 tests. Okay, so the first one being 25 and 27, and the other one being 55 and 105. Okay, so as we can see here, they both don't have the same last digit, right? Because here is 7 and here is 5, so this is going to return 0. And these both have the same last digit, so it's going to return 1. Why? Because we're using the reminder in this case, okay? So let's make problem 11. So we have to use a semicolon here when we finish the part of return. So let's do this again. So no problems. Let's put a breakpoint in here, okay, to check what happens. So debug 50, problem 11. Let's see. So let's run our code, step into. So the first condition, the first test is x equals 27 and y equals 25. Okay, and when we run, it's going to print in here what? It's going to print 0 because both of them don't have the same last digit. Okay, and then next we have x equals 55 and here y equals 105, and it's going to return 1. Okay, so I'm just going to do in a slower way just to you see what's happening. So reminder 1 is equals to this. We're going to do this way. Okay, I'm going to put this in variables so you can understand what's happening, and this is going to be called as reminder 1, and we're going to create another variable to put the reminder 2. Okay, I think this will be easier to understand. Control X, Control V, reminder 2. So this is the same code as before, but now I create 2 integers, 2 new variables as integers, just for us to see in the debugger, okay, to make things easier. So make problem 11. Let's put the breakpoint in here. So let's see, not in here, we're going to put a breakpoint in here. So debug 50, problem 11. So let's check. So our first problem, so reminder of 27 divided by 10, it's what? Is 7, right? The remainder of 25 divided by 10, it's 5, right? So we have this as x and y, and this as the reminder. Now the 920, it's going to check if both of these reminders are the same. Since they are not the same, it's going to return 0. Okay, we can see here in the terminal. And now we're going to call the function again. So first, we're going to do the first reminder, and we have 55 divided by 10. The remainder is 5, okay, as we can see here. And when we do the same when we do the 105 divided by 10, we have the same reminder as 5. So it's going to return what? 1, okay? Problem 12 from Programming Fundamentals, okay, and the problem is, write a C program to compute the sum of the 2 given integers. If the sum is in the range of 10, 20 inclusive, return 30, okay? So what we have to do, we're going to do the sum and check if the sum is in the range of 10 and 20 inclusive, okay? So we're going to do the sum of 2 integers, and if the sum is in the range of 10 and 20 inclusive, we're going to return 30. Since I use if, we're going to have the else. So else, it's going to return the sum of these 2 integers, okay? So let's start including the libraries for our program. So remember, include stdio.h, that is the standard standard library, sorry, and now we're going to create our main function. But instead of doing this inside our main function, we're going to create a new function, okay? So our new function, it's going to return or the sum of these two integers, or it's going to return 30. So since it's going to return our number, the type of our program, our function is going to be an int, okay, an integer. I'm going to call it text, and we're going to use two integers as input that we're going to get, okay? So since we create our function in here, we have to put a prototype before the int main function, right? And then you have to put the semicolon, and we're going to start our program. So we have to do the sum, and if the sum is one thing, we're going to return 30, or we're going to return the sum itself. So first we're going to create a variable called sum, okay, just to make things more clear. So we're going to sum int x plus, sorry, not int x, we're going to sum x plus y, right? So this variable sum is going to store the value of the sum of these two integers. And now we're going to do the if and else condition, okay? So the first if, what's the condition? Is that this sum here should be in the range of 10 and 20 inclusive, okay? So how do we do this? We're going to read this part here in CS50 notes that we use two vertical bars, okay, to indicate a logical OR, whether either expression can be true for the condition to be followed. The ampersands, whoa, this is a new name for me, indicate a logical AND, where both conditions would have to be true. So what are we going to use in this case? So in our case, both of the conditions has to be true. So we're going to use these ampersands, okay? So what's the first condition? To be in the range of 10 and 20 inclusive. So we have to put here sum is greater or equal than 10. And, so this is the logical operator for AND. Sum is less than or equal than 20, okay? And if this condition is satisfied, we're going to return 30, okay? Return 30. The else case is the other cases instead that it's not satisfied inside this condition here. So we're going to return just the sum, okay? So we did the part of our function. Now we have to call the function test in our main function. So we're going to do two tests in this case to test these two cases that we have, the if and else. So the first is test 12, 17, okay, and the other it's going to be printf %i. So remember, %i is a placeholder that we want to hold the value of this thing here, because this function is going to return as a number, okay? And test 21, 0, for example, okay? So sorry, we're going to return 10, 9, for example. So let's check, okay? I'm going to do here make problem 12, so no problems with compiling, and I'm going to put a breakpoint in this line, and we're going to use the debug 50 to understand what's happening, okay? So let's wait our code work. So we have by now the x equals 12 and the y equals 17. This sum here has a random value that our code creates when he doesn't know which value is the integer that we're going to use. So now we're going to define the sum. So 12 plus 17 is 29. and it's going to check the first condition. So this sum is inside this range? No, right? So it's going to the else part and it's going to return the value of the sum. So we're going to see here 29, okay? And now it's going to check the second test that we're doing. So the sum of 10 plus 9 is what? 19. So it's going to check the first if. So 19 is in the range of 10 and 20 inclusive. Yes, so it's going to return 30. Okay? So this is problem 13. Okay, and the problem is write a C program that accepts two integers and return true if either one is 5 or their sum or difference is 5. So the idea is we're going to get two integers, okay, and with these two integers we're going to check these four conditions that are: if one of these two integers is 5, if the other is 5, if their sum is 5, or if their difference is 5. Okay, so let's start creating our including our library. So remember, we have to include the library that is stdio, that is the standard library for C language. Okay, and we're going to start our int main void function and open and close curly braces. Okay, for this case we're going to create a function, okay, to solve this problem. So remember, when we create function, we have to declare our created function first with a prototype, so like this way here, before we use it in the main. So we call the function in the main, and then we're going to define what this function does. Okay, so let's start. The name of the function that we're going to create is int test. Since we're going to compare two integers, doing some things with these two integers, we're going to pass as input two integers, okay? So here we're defining the function, and remember we have to declare this prototype before the int main void. Okay, so we declare the variables and now we're going to do the problem, okay? So we want to return true if either these two integers is 5 or their sum or difference is 5, okay? So we're going to do some conditions in here, okay? So we can do if x equals 5, or we're going to return here, return 1, because 1 is true. Remember, in C, in programming language, 1 is true and 0 is false. Else if y equals 5, okay, and it's going to return 1. Else if x plus y. Actually, I'm going to create here a variable that is going to be called as sum, so int sum, and in this int sum we're going to store the value of this sum here, and we're going to create int diff that it's going to store the value of this difference here, okay? So we're going to do else if sum equals 5, okay? We're going to return 1 again because this represents true. Else if diff equals 5, okay, and we're going to return again 1. And else, the other cases, it's going to return 0, that it's false, okay? So, but in here we have to think one thing. If we do this difference here, for example, we have 10 minus 5, it's going to return 5, right? And here it's going to return 1 because it's true. But if x is 5 and y is 10, it's going to the difference is going to be minus 5, right? But we want to include this value too because the difference between these numbers keeps being 5, right? So in this case, we're going to use the absolute value of int, and this absolute value is a function that we're going to get using this library here, okay? So since we're going to use this library, we have to include, so hash include stdlib.h, so yes, this way, stdlib.h, and we're going to use in here apps, okay? And for now, we're going to check, since we finish creating our function, we're going to check some examples. So we're going to do printf. Remember, we have to use the placeholder since we want to know what is the value of this test in here. So the first test we're going to do 5 and 4, well, actually 10 and 5, okay. We're going to do the print again because we're going to check each case, okay? 5 and 10, right? Another one we're going to do. Actually, I'm going to change this to 11 and 6 because 5 is one of the requests, right? So 6 and 11, here we can put like 4 and 5 because we want to check this case here. We are going to create another one. So 5 and 4 because we want to check this first condition here. And now we're going to check the sum also. So we're going to do 4 and 1 and it's going to return the sum, right? And we're going to do the last case here that is going to be 0 and 1. Okay, so we're going to save. And now let's use the debug 50 to check what's actually happening in here, okay? So debug 50 problem 13, no such file. Why no such file? Whoa. What is the problem in here? For some reason it's not working. So, oh yes, sorry, we have to make problem 13, right? We have to do the compile and now we can use the debug 50 problem 13, okay? So let's do this debug 50. So the first case, x and y has value 11 and 6. Their sum is 17 and their diff is 5, right? So it's going to check the first case. It's not, since x is not equals to 5, it's going to the next case, okay? Then since y is not equals to 5, it's going to check the other about the sum. Since the sum is not equals to 5, it's going to check the difference. And in our case, the difference has value 5, so it's going to return 1, okay? And it's going to appear here. Now the next, when we have the 6 minus 11, okay? So if we check in this case, our diff is 5, it's not minus 5 because we're using the absolute value in here, okay? And since the only case that our problem is going to be applied is in diff equals 5, so it's going to check the other cases and it's going to return 1 in this case here where the difference is equal 5. Now it's going to check again, so our y is equals to 5, so it's going to check the first case, it's not the one but it's the second, y equals 5, right? So it's going to return 1. We're going to run it again since x is equals 5, so it's going to stop in the first condition, right? The next one, let's see. So we see here that the sum is 5 and the difference is 3. So it's going to stop in the condition that it's sum, right? And the next case, it's going to check each condition, but since none of these conditions is applied for this case, it's going to return the else case, right? So this is the harder or not the smarter way to do this problem, okay? Because if you see, we're using too many lines. But we can use a different way, that it's one that you already know because we used in the previous problems. That is, we're going to just use return. And in the return, we're going to use the conditions where this return is true. So we're going to put here the conditions where it's going to return 1. And if none of these conditions is satisfied, it's going to return 0. So we're going to do this here. X equals 5. Or, this is the OR operator as we saw before, okay? Y equals 5. Or X plus Y equals 5, or the absolute value of X minus Y equals 5, okay? So let's make problem 13, and now let's use the debug 50 to check. I forgot to use a breakpoint, so now let's see. So this makes our code cleaner, right? Has less lines that we had before, and I think it's better for us to understand what's happening. So passes here the value of X and Y, right? And since it's satisfied, it's going to return 1, and the rest we already know. Because in this case, the debug 50 is not so good because we just see the values that are entering, but we can't see what's happening here. That's why we did in a slower way before, okay? So now let's see problem 14. Loop through values from 1 to 50 inclusive. If the current number is divisible by 3, print fis. If the current number is divisible by 5, print bus. If the current number is divisible by both 3 and 5, print fis bus. Else print the number. So what we're going to do. So it's a loop, right? So let's start including our library, stdio.h, okay? That's the standard value, standard library, sorry. And then we're going to start our main function. In this case, we're going to do everything inside the main function, okay? So it says here, loop through values from 1 to 50 inclusive. So in this case, we're going to do a for loop, okay? So let's see here the part of for loops that we have. Where is it? Just a second, I think it's in here. So let's see here. First, we create a variable named I and set it to 0. Okay, in our case, we're going to set it to 1 actually, because we want to do a loop through values from 1 to 50 inclusive. Okay, and then we're going to then check the limit of our for loop. So our limit in this case is 50 inclusive, so we're going to use 51 because for loop normally, for example, in here we can use, where is it I lost, okay, so we can use here I equals or less than 50, okay, and then we will use the increment because we want to add 1 to y, and then the loop repeats, okay. So check it on the CS50 notes. So we're going to do for int I equals 1 because we want to start our for loop in 1, okay. I less than or equals to 50 because we want 50 inclusive, okay. And then we're going to increment sorry. And now we're going to do these for loops here, these conditions here. So we're going to use the conditions part of CS50 nodes, okay. So check this later so you can understand better the idea. In this case, we want to see if the number is divisible by 3 or 4. So how are we going to do this? We're going to use the remainder, okay? So I don't know if you remember this in division, but let's open this here. Okay, so the remainder. so we have a division here like 10 divided by 2. So what's the quotient? It's 5 because 5 multiplied by 2 is 10. And what's the remainder? It's 0, okay? Because there's nothing left in this division. But if we had a division like 11 divided by 2, we would have 1 as remainder, because 2 multiplied by 5 is 10, 11 minus 10, 1. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to see if it's divisible, checking if the division of I by 3 has a remainder equals 0, or I divided by 5 has a remainder equals 0, okay? Because we want to check if they are divisible by these two numbers, and then we're going to do this if and else cases. So what we're going to do first, the first if, we're going to do I remainder. This is the operator for remainder, okay, in C language. So the remainder of I divided by 3 is equals 0. And this is the operator of AND, okay? So should this if be satisfied, both of these inputs that I'm going to put here has to be satisfied too, okay? And the division by I of I by 5 has to be a remainder equals 0. So this is the first case where we're going to print FizzBuzz, because the number is divided by both 3 and 5, okay? So this case it's going to print FizzBuzz, okay? And then we're going to do an else if the remainder of I divided by 3 equals 0. We're going to printf this first case here. We're going to printf fizz, okay? And the other else if is the remainder of I divided by 5 equals 0. We're going to print f buzz, and we have the else case, okay? And in the else case, what we're going to print the number. So we're just going to printf the number. So to printf the number, we have to use a placeholder, remember? And we're going to put I because the placeholder is holding the value of I, right? So let's check. We're going to make problem 14. So we have one error here. Let's see what is this error. So we forgot to use what we forgot to use in here. Let me check. Oh yes, we forgot to use, it's not a comma here, it's a semicolon. Okay, so let's make problem 14. So no problems with the running part. And now let's see the result. Problem 14. So if we check here, we're going to see each number. So in this case, I forgot to use this operator here that makes the terminal to print things in a different line, in another line. So let's just run this again, clear, make problem 14. So we can see here it's doing the iteration from I until 50. Okay, it's buzz in this case because 50 is it has a remainder 0 in the division by 5, and we're checking that prints fizz buzz depending on the case. Okay, so now let's check problem 15. So write a program in C to display the pattern like right angle triangle using an asterisk. The pattern like, so we want to print 1 star in the first line, 2 in the second, 3 in the third, and 4 in the fourth. So in each line we're incrementing a star and we're going to the next line. Okay, so if you go to CS50 notes, we have the part of Mario. Okay, so I highly recommend you to check this part. And what we're going to do is we're going to create 2 nested for loops where the outer loop uses I to do everything inside, and in this case it's 3 times, okay? And the inner for loop uses another variable to do some iteration. In other words, the outer loop print 3 rows or lines, ending each of them with a new line, and the inner loop will print 3 columns. So the idea is, I know it sounds a little bit confusing, but we're going to do 2 for loops in this case, okay? And the outer for loop is going to command the changing of row, and the inner for loop is going to command the change of column, okay? So what's going to do? The outer for loop is going to command this thing here, so it's going to change the lines, and the inner for loop is going to command the change of column, okay, of this part here. So let's start. So every code, we have to include the stdio.h library, right? And we're going to get a number of rows from the user, okay? So we're going to use the CS50 library because when we want to ask the user an integer, we have to use the getInt function that it's the function that is included in CS50 library, okay? So let's start our int main void, and we're going to start creating our variable called rows, because these rows we're going to get by getInt, and we're going to pass as input like number of rows, okay? And then the user is going to place the number of rows this user wants. And now we're going to do the part of for loops, okay? So remember this part of for loops. In our for loop we have to give 3 inputs: the start of the for loop, the limit where we want to stop the for loop, and if we want to increment or decrease the value of the for loop, okay, of the integer that we are iterating. So let's start our for in int I. We're going to use I in this case, and since we want to have, since we're going to do a for loop this way, we're going to use 1 because we want to have 1 line, 2 lines. It's just to get things clear, okay? Then our limit is less than or equals to rows, okay, because it's the number of rows we want, and we're going to increment the value of this variable, okay? And now this is going to command, so this is for the lines, okay, for the rows, and now the inner for loop, it's for the columns, okay? So now we're going to do an inner for loop, and we're going to start a new variable. In this case, I'm going to call columns just to make things easier, okay? So I'm going to initialize this with value 1 because we want as the same idea of line 1 and star 1, okay? The limit is for in each line, you see that this value of stars increase. So that's the idea. We're going to have as limit, so columns, the limit is to be less or greater than I. That it's the iteration that I is in this case, okay? Saying this way, it's not so clear, but when we use the debug 50, it's going to be better, okay? And what we're going to print inside each for loop, we're going to print the star, okay? So here we're going to do printf star, okay? So this is what each iteration inside the column is going to print. And after the iteration inside the column, we're going to do what the inner for loop is going to do. So here, printf, changing the space. I know it's confusing, but it's going to be easier when we use the debugger. Okay, so make problem 15. So we have a problem here. Let me see. So what's the problem? So we forgot to increase here, so sorry. Okay, so let's check again. So no problems with compiling. Now I'm going to put a breakpoint in here, and we're gonna use debug 50 problem 15. Okay, so let's check. So it's running our code until, let's put, so in here we have 4 lines, so we're going to have to put here number 4 because we want to output the same thing. Why is not working? Sorry. Whoa, I put too many numbers. So let's run this again because this is a huge number. So let's step into how many rows? 4. And now let's see. This is the first iteration here. So we have here rows equals 4 because it's the input that we give. Okay, for the first iteration, I equals 1. So in the I equals 1, then we're going to enter in this for loop here, and we see column equals 1. So in the first iteration is column less or equals than I, and I in this case is 1, so both of them is 1. So what it's going to print? Just a star. Okay, so we see here to print just a star. It's going to check again. But since we already did this part here, this for loop is not satisfied anymore, we're going to get out from this inner for loop, and we're going to get to the end of the outer for loop. And the end of the outer for loop is to print this space here, okay? And then we go to the next line. Then here we see our I is equals to 2 because we increment this value, and now our column is equals to 2. So let's see. In the first iteration of the inner for loop, it's going to print a star. Now it's going to do the iteration again, and it's going to print another star. Since the column has so let's see here, since column has value 2 and I has value 2, it's going to stop this for loop, and then it's going to print the space. Okay, so let's do this again. Now I is equals 3, column is equals 1, so column 1 I 3, it's going to do this check in here. So columns equals 1, and then 1 is less than 3, so it's going to print this first star. Okay, now column is going to be 2, and 2 is less than 3, so it's going to print again another star. And then 3, our column now has value 3, okay, like in here. And since 3 is equals to 3, that it's our limit, it's going to print another star. So it's going to check again this for loop, but it's out of range, and now it's going to get out from this inner for loop and go to this print part here. And now it's going to go to another line. Then it's going to increment the value of I to 4. Okay, now we're initializing column with value 1, so 1 is less than 4, so it's going to print the first star. Then now column has value 2, okay, as we can see here. Now 2 is less than 4, so it's going to print another star. Okay, now column has value 3, and 3 is less than 4, so it's going to print another star. Now it's going to do another iteration, so 4 is equal than 4, so it's going to print another 4 because it's inside these conditions. And now, since if we increment the value, column would be 5, but we don't want to pass the value of I, then in this case I is equals 4, so it's going to stop this for loop, and we're going to the end of this outer for loop that is printing the next line. Okay, and then since I has the same value as rows, it's going to stop this outer for loop, okay? And then stop the code, and we have our triangle here, okay? So now let's do problem 16. Write a program in C to make such a pattern like right-angle triangle with a number which will repeat a number in a row. So this problem we're going to do basically the same as we did before, okay? But now we're going to change the numbers. And how we're going to do this? We're going to, I don't know if you remember the previous problem that we used the star, and in this case we're going to use numbers, okay? So let's start including our library, standard library, so stdio.h, and in this case we're going to get also an integer input from the user, so we have to use the cs50.h because this library has the getInt function, okay? Now we start our int main void, and now we're going to do the problem. So first we're going to get the number of rows, okay? So we're creating a variable called rows, and we're going to start to store the getInt function, okay? So number of rows, okay? So we're going to get the integer from the user using this, and now we're going to do the inner and outer for loop, okay? So remember, the for loop has to have 3 inputs, so we have to initialize a variable and where our for loop is going to start, so I equals 1. Then we have to get the limit of this iteration, that it's I less than or equals to rows, okay? Because we want to have the exactly number of rows that the user gave to us, so we have to use rows as limit. And we're going to increment the value of I, okay? And this is the outer for loop. This outer for loop is controlling the rows, okay? And the inner for loop is going to control the value of the columns, okay? So in this case, we're going to do a for loop using another integer that we're going to start as 1 also, okay? What is the limit for this I, of this j variable? It's I, okay? Because this inner for loop is being controlled by this outer for loop. That's why we're using this inside that one. So every iteration that this for loop is going to have, this outer for loop is going to have, it's going to change the limit of this inner for loop, okay? And then we have to increment the value of j. So what we're going to print in each column? What we're going to do, we're going to print the value of I, okay? Because, for example, in the first case, so I equals 1, right? So in I equals 1, we're going to have the first row because the outer for loop, the I, is controlling the row. And then in the inner, we're going to print what we want to appear. So in the first case, it's going to print 1. In the second iteration, I it's going to be 2, right? But j, it's going to be 1 and 2. But in this case, we want to print just 2. So we're going to use I because I keeps being 2. And we're going to use this value in each j equals 1 and j equals 2, okay? And so on and so forth. I know it seems confusing, but the debug is going to help us. So in here we have to use the placeholder, and the value that this placeholder is holding is for the I variable. And outside this for loop, so after this for loop, we're going to change the line, and this is the last thing that this outer for loop is going to do. So after this inner for loop stops, we're going to print to break the line, right? And we're going to start another iteration for the row, okay? So here we're going to printf new line, okay? So let's make problem 16 to check, so no problems with compiling. And now we're going to use the debug 50 to check what's happening. In this case, I forgot to use a breakpoint. I'm going to use in here. So debug 50. Let's check. So first is going to appear here number of rows. We're going to use 4 just to see this better. Okay, the same example that it passes. So in the first case, I is equals 1, right? So the first iteration, I is equals 1, and j is equals to 1 also. Okay, so this is the first iteration, and then what is going to print? 1, right? Because j is 1 and is less than or equal to I that has value 1, so it's going to do this for loop here. Okay, and then it's going to check again this for loop. But if we increment j to 1, we're going to have j equals 2, but j equals 2 is greater than 1. That's why it stops this for loop, and we're going to this line here where we're going to break the line. Okay, then we're going again to this outer for loop, and in here we're going to change the value of I. Okay, then we're going to have j equals 1, okay, because we are always initializing this variable here, j. So 1 is less than 2, right? So it's going to print this line here. And what's this value that is going to print? 2, right? Because we're getting the value of I to print in this case, because we want to be this pattern here, okay? So it's going to print 2, and then it's going to check again the for loop. And in this case, j is going to be 2. So since j is equal to I, what is going to happen again in here again? It's going to print this part here, and it's going to print I again. So we're going to have 2 again. Then it's going to check this for loop, but in this case, j would be 3, but we want to stop this for loop in 2, so it's not going to happen. We're going to change the line, and that's going to happen again. So now I is equals to 3 and j is equals to 1 again. So we're going to do the for loop, and it's going to print the first 3 here. Now j has value 2. Since 2 is less than 3, it's going to print again I. So it's going to print again 3 in here. Now it's going to increment again. J is equals to I because 3 is equals to 3. So it's going to print again this line here. And now we're going to check. So if we increment j, it would be 4, but 4 it's out of range here. So it's going to print the new line, okay? And now the last part we already know. So I is equals to 4, j is equals to 1, so it's going to print. And then we increment j to 2, and 2 is less than 4, it's going to print again. Now j is equals to 3, and 3 is less than 4, so it's going to print again. Now j is equals to 4. That is equals to I, so it's going to print again. Now it's going to check. So in this case, j would be 5, but 5 is greater than 4, and we don't want this, so it's going to stop this inner for loop. Now it's going to break the line. Here we're going to check if we can keep doing this for loop, but in this case, if we increment I, it would be 5. But 5 would be greater than the number of rows that we passed before, that was 4. So it's going to stop, we're going to stop the outer for loop, and we have our problem, okay? So this is problem 17. Write a program you see to make such a pattern like right angle triangle with number increased by 2 in this case, okay, or increased by actually by 1. Sorry. So this is the pattern. In the first row we have just 1, the second row we're going to have 2 and 3, on the third row 4, 5 and 6, and so on and so forth. Okay, so since we already saw problem 15 and 16, we know that we have to do an inner and outer for loop to do this. Okay, so we're going to first include stdio.h, right, because this is the standard library, and we're going to include the cs50.h, but because in this case we're going to get from the user an input to an integer input in this case, okay? So this is the int main void, and first of all we're going to get the number of rows that the user wants. So we're initializing rows as a variable, get int, we're calling this function, number of rows, okay. And now we're going to do the for loop. Oops. Remember, the for loop has to have 3 inputs. The first one we're initializing a variable, okay. The second one, we're giving a limit to this variable that is rows, and we're incrementing in here. So this we already saw in the previous problems, and we're going to do the same in the inner for loop, okay. J lesser equals to I, okay. I already explained this before, that's why I'm not going to explain this again. If you want to know, check the previous problem 16, okay. But in this case, we don't want to print 1 1 2 2 3 3 3, right? We want to increase in each iteration 1 to the number that it's going to appear. So in this case, we're going to create a new variable that in this case we're going to call as k, okay. And we're going to start with number 1 because this is going to be printed in this first line here, okay. And in each iteration in the inner for loop, we're going to print this variable k, okay, but we have to increase this value here. So we're going to do what? We're going to printf placeholder I, because we want to print the value of k. And after printing, what we want to increase the value of k. So this here represents, like this case here, k equals k plus 1, okay. This is the same thing, but we're going to use k plus plus. So in each iteration in the inner for loop, we're going to print a value of k, and in each iteration we're going to increment this value. That's why we have 1 2 3 4 5 6, okay. And then in the outer for loop, after all of this, we're going to break the line, okay. So let's check what happens. I'm going to put the breakpoint here, make problem 17, debug 50, problem 17, and let's check. So it's going to appear here, number of rows. So we're going to put, it's 4 again, right? So here, oops, I make a mistake. Probably you were thinking and you were right. So we have to initialize as 1, right? Because we want to start in the first line in this case. So let's make problem 17, I'm sorry, debug 50, problem 17, okay. So now let's check number of rows. It's going to appear here. So I want 4, okay. So the first case, I is equals to 1, okay, and j is equals to 1. And remember, our k was initialized as 1 also. So since I is 1 and j is 1 and this condition is satisfied, we're going to print this line here, okay. That is the value of k, so it's going to print 1, okay, as we can see here. So print 1, and in this case we're going to increment the value of k. So now k is going to become 2, okay. Now we're going to check if we're going to do this for loop again, but if we increment j, it's going to become 2, and 2 is greater than 1. So we're going to stop this inner for loop and we're going to end the outer for loop with this break line here. Now we have I equals 2, okay, and j equals 1, so we're going to print this because 1 is less than 2, and we're going to print what? K. But now what's the value of k? 2, okay. Now we're going to increment the value of k, and it's going to become 3, okay. Now we have j equals 2 and 2 is equals to 2, so we are satisfying this condition here. Then it's going to print here again, okay. So it's going to print here what? It's going to print k, that it's 3 in this case. So we're going to see here 3, right? And then we have to increment the value of k, so k is going to become 4. Now it's going to check, but if we increment j, it's going to become j equals 3, but 3 is greater than 2, so it's going to stop this inner for loop. We break the line, and we're going to start a new iteration in the outer for loop. Now I is equals to 3, j equals 1 again, because we're always initializing this in here. So 1 is less than 3, so we're going to print k is 4, so here it's going to print 4. And now we're going to increment k. So k is going to become 5, and we're going to do this again. I think you already understand, okay? So j equals 2, but 2 is less than 3, so we're going to print this part here. It's going to print 5 because k is 5. And now we're going to increment k, and it's going to become 6, right? So it's going to check again, j equals 3. So 3 is equals to 3, so our condition is okay. So it's going to print this line here, but now our k is 6, so it's going to appear here 6. And now we have to increment this k, and it becomes 7. Now we're going to check if we can do the for loop, but if we increment j, it's going to become 4, and 4 is greater than 3, so it doesn't satisfy this condition. That's why we stop the inner for loop, we break the line, and we go to the next iteration. Now I is equals to 4, j is equals to 1, so it's going to print because 1 is less than 4, and it's going to print 7. And now we're going to increment the value of k and become 8. Okay, now j is equals to 2, and 2 is less than 4, so it's going to print k here, that it's 8. And now we're going to increment the value of k and become 9. Now j is equals to 3 is less than 4, that's why we're going to print this line again, so it's going to appear here 9. Okay, and now we're going to increment, so k is 10. Now j is equals to 4, and 4 is equals to I, so this condition is the last that can be satisfied in the for loop. That's why we're going to print again, okay? So it's going to appear 10. And we're going to increment k to 11. Now we're going to check if we can keep going in the for loop, but if we increment j, it's going to be 5, and 5 is greater than I. So it's going to stop this inner for loop, and we're going to check here. I would be, if we increment I, it would be 5, but 5 is greater than rows, that in this case is 4, so that's why we stop this outer for loop also, okay? Just one thing that it's different, it's because in here we have a space, so just to make this, we have to put a space after the placeholder, okay? I'm not going to debug again, I'm just going to show the last result, because we just changed one silly thing on the printf, okay? So let's run the code, and we have the same output, okay? Okay, so now we're going to work with getNum in a credit card, okay? So the idea is we're going to get a value from the user, that it's his credit card number, and we're going to get how many digits has this credit card, okay? So in order to do this, we're going to start including the stdio.h, that is the standard library. And since we want to get a value from the user, we're going to use the hash include cs50.h. So we're going to use the cs50 library, okay? Remember, we have the getInt. We also have the get long. And what's long? So long, it's integers with more bits, so they can count higher than an int. Since we want to get a number that it's bigger than an int, we're going to use the long, okay, the long type. And we have in cs50 library a getLong that works exactly like getInt, but instead of int, it's going to get a long, okay? So that's why in here we're going to get a number. So long num credit card, for example, we're going to use the get long. What's your credit card number? Right? So we're going to check to take this number from the user. Okay, it works the same way as the get int, and we're going to initialize a variable called num of digits, because in this variable here we're going to store the num of digits that we're going to get in a created function. Okay, so let's start. Remember, when we create functions, where is it? We have to declare our created function first with a prototype before we use it in main and actually define it after. Okay, so we're going to create a function called int because we're going to return the num of digits in this function, and we're going to call this function as get num digits. Okay, and the input, it's going to be this long here. Okay, so it's long credit card. Okay, actually I'm going to give another name just so you understand. So long card number. Okay, so remember, this is our created function, so the name is get num digits, and the input, it's a long type variable. Okay, so we have to copy and paste here as a prototype, and remember to use the semicolon here after. And now we're going to do what? We're going to do the iteration that we have to do when we want to get the nums of digits in a number. Okay, so we're going to initialize a variable called count, because this variable is going to count how many digits has in the credit card. Okay, and we're going to do a while loop. I don't know if you remember, but here it's a while loop. Okay, so while this condition is true, it's going to do something inside. Okay, so that's the idea. We're going to do while card number. Remember, everything that is inside this function here has to use this name. In this case, the names that are defined inside this part in here. Okay, so while card number is different, this is a symbol for different. Okay, so while card number is different than 0, what we're going to do? We're going to divide card number by 10. Okay, and we're going to increment the counter. So in each iteration, for example, if we have a card number equals to 1, 2, 3, 4. So in the first iteration, the while loop, we're going to divide this by 10. So what we're going to have? 1, 2, 3, right? And we're going to count, and our count is going to become 1. In the next iteration, card number 1, 2, 3 divided by 10, it's going to become 12. Okay, and the count is going to increment by 1, so it's going to become 2. And we're going to do this so on and so forth. Number equals to 1, 2 divided by 10, so the count is 3. Card number 1 divided by 10, it's not going to give us an integer, so we're going to stop in this case. Okay, that's what it's going to happen. And in the end of all of this, what we're going to do, we're going to return the count, because this count is going to count how many digits we have in our card number. Okay, so in here, in num of digits, we're going to call the function get num digits, and we have to pass an input. Okay, here I put a name for this input, long card number, but the variable where we're storing the card number, it's called in our main function credit card. So we're going to pass credit card, okay? And this is understandable by this function here because this is just a prototype. We're just passing long card number. We just give a name for this. So if we pass credit card and credit card has type long, so the created functions understand that this is the new name for card number, okay? And now we're going to printf. So take a look better on this on lecture 1. You're going to understand, okay? And we're going to print your number. Number has the placeholder, in this case I, because we're using an integer, digits, okay? And remember we have to pass which variable this placeholder is holding, that it's digits, okay? So let's make problem 18. Let's check, no problem with compiling. And let's do the debug 50 in here, in the while loop. So debug 50, problem 18. So let's see. It's going to pass here, what's your credit card number, right? So I'm going to put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And let's check. So we're going to enter in this condition here, okay? So this is the credit card number, count is equal 0. So this is true, so since this is different than 0, we're going to do this iteration. So now card become 1, 2, 3, 4 because we took out the 5, okay? And we're going to increment 1. Since the card number is 1234, this condition is why it becomes true again. It's while true again because this is different than 0. So we're going to do this iteration again. So we're going to divide this card number by 10 and then it become 123. And we're going to increment the count too, okay? Since card number is 123, this is different than 0. So we're going to do this condition again. And now the card number become 12, and we're going to increment the count, 3. Since 12 is different than 0, so this is true, and we're going to do the while loop again. So now we're going to divide by 10, and we're going to increment this count, 4. Now, since 1 is different than 0, so we're going to do this again, okay, this for loop again. 1 divided by 10, it's going to give 0 because we're working with integers. So this rounds for 0, not give us a decimal value, okay? That's why it becomes 0, and we're going to increment this count. Now, card number has value 0, so this part here, it's false. That's why this while loop stops, and we're going to return this to the main part, and it's going to be printed your number has 5 digits, okay? Okay, so now on problem 19 we're going to do the sum of every other digit, okay? So let's start. So first we have to include the stdio.h library, that is the standard library that we use, okay? And we're going to include the cs50.h because we want to get this, we want to get a number from the user, okay? So int main void, and we're going to write inside the main function. And first we're going to create a variable that has type long, okay? So remember the previous problem where we used long, and we're going to set this long variable as num. And in this case, we're going to use the get long because we want to get a number with type long, okay? So what's your number? Okay. And now we're going to do a function, okay? So the type will be int because we want to pass the sum of every other digit. So since it's the sum of digits, it's not going to be a great number, so we can use an integer, okay? So the name will be sum of every other digit, okay, and the type it's a long card num. In we can give this name, for example, okay. So let's take this and pass as prototype here before the main function. And remember, this name that I'm giving inside the created function don't need to be the same name as we're going to use in the main function here, okay? They can be called in different ways, but since we put the name inside this input, the compiler will understand that we're working with a long, okay? I know it sounds confusing, but you should check CS50 notes, okay? So let's start creating a variable called int is alternate digit, because this is going to be one of the things that we're going to check if it's false, if there is an alternate digit or no. So we're going to check if it's false or true, okay? We're going to create a variable first, the sum, and we're going to initialize it as 0 because by now we have the sum as 0. We're not summing anything by now, okay? And now we're going to do a while loop. So remember, the while loop is going to happen until this condition that we're going to write here inside is true, okay? So the condition is going to be the same as the other. Same no, in this case, it's going to be card number greater than 0, okay? So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to do a condition. So if is alternate digit true, this is the idea. So if is alternate digit true, what is going to happen? We're going to do the sum of this digit. So to get how we get the digit, we're going to use the remainder again, okay? So we're going to pass card num divided by 10, and the remainder, remember the remainder, it's the one that we're going to take. So remember, let's do the division here. So we have a division in here, 11 divided by 2. So 11 divided by 2 has quotient 5, right? Because 5 multiplied by 2 is 10. And what's the remainder? 1, right? Because 2 multiplied by 5 is 10, 11 minus 10 is 1. So this is what we're going to get. So in this division, what would be, in this case, what we're doing, if the card number has value 11, if we divide it by 10, the remainder would be 1, okay? And then we're going to do this for each iteration, right? And then what we're going to do, we're going to do the is alternate digit. Since we want to alternate the digit, we're going to set this alternate digit with a different value that it was before. So for example, if it start is alternate digit false, so in here we're going to change it to true, and in the next iteration we're going to change it to false. So what we're going to do, we're going to use this thing here. This is alternate digit in here, this way. This is how we change the idea that was before. So this is a boolean. Since it was false, it's going to become true. In the next iteration, since it's true, it's going to become false, and so on and so forth, okay? And we want to do the same thing as we did in problem 18, that we want to take take the next digit from the card. So that's why we're going to divide this card num by 10, okay? And then after this while, we're going to return the sum, because we want the sum of every other digit. Now we're going to call this function in our main function, okay? So int sum digits, we're going to store the value of this thing here, okay? The name of the function, but we're not past long card num. What's our long card num in this case? It's this num here, so we're going to pass num, okay? And then we're going to printf the sum is and the placeholder that is holding the value of some digits, okay? So let's check, make problem 19. So we have a problem here. Let's see, I forgot to use in here the semicolon and in here also. Okay, so clear. Let's make this again. So it's working. Now let's use a debugger in here to check what's happening, okay? So let's see, debug 50, problem 19, and let's see. So I'm going to pass now the same value as we pass in the other, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, this is the number. So it's going to check. So card number is greater than 0. By now it is, okay, because we have this huge number here as card number. And we see here this alternate digit we set as false, so it has value 0 as we saw in the previous examples, and our sum was initialized at 0, okay? So now we're going to do a step into, so if alternate digit, so in this case it's going to check if is alternate digit is true, right? But since this is not true, it's going to pass this if and it's going to the next line of the code, so nothing happens here when you're not summing anything. So is alternate digit, and now this alternate digit is going to change to 1 because it became true, right? This represents the opposite of the value that it's representing. So since here is false, now this is going to become true, and true has value 1. And now we're going to divide the card number by 10. See here, we divide by 10, and now we have this number here. So since this value of card number is greater than 0, so we're going to do this while loop again. So in this case, now this is alternate digit equals true. This is what represent is equals true. Since this satisfies this condition, we're going to sum. So we're going to sum 4 to the sum. Okay, so now sum is equals to 4 because before it was 0. Now we're going to change the is alternate digit. Since it's true, now it's going to become false, so it's going to change the number to 0. Okay, and now we're going to divide by 10 to take another digit from the card number. Since this value of card number is greater than 0, so we're going to have this while loop. And in this case, this is alternate digit is false, so it's not going to happen any sum in this case. And now we're going to change the false to true for the next iteration, as we can see in here, changing to 1, that 1 represents true. And we're going to divide the card number by 10. Okay, as we can see here, 12. So 12 is greater than 0, so we're going to do the while loop. In this case, is alternate digit represents true, so this condition is satisfied. Then we're going to sum this to the sum that we already had. So we're going to have 6 because it was 2, the remainder of this division 12 by 10, and the sum was before 4, so now 4 plus 2, it's 6, okay? Now is alternate digit is going to change true and set this to false, so it's going to change to 0, that represents false, remember? And now we're going to divide this by 10. Our card number has value 1, so 1 is greater than 1, so we're going to have the for loop. Now here it's false, so that's why we're going to jump this condition because it's not satisfied. And we're going to change this is alternate to true, so it's going to change here to 1. And we're going to divide by 10 the card number. And now the card number has value 0, so this condition now it's false, so we stop the while loop. And we're going to return the sum and print the sum is 6. Okay? And now let's go to the last problem, that is grab the first 2 digits of this number that he passes. Okay, so you're seeing this long number, so let's start. First we're going to include the stdio.h library, okay, and we're going to start our int main void function in here. So to solve this problem, first we have to initialize the num that we want to grab the 2 digits, that is this number here. Okay, so I'm passing in here, right? So we have this num set. And now we have 2 ways of doing this problem. The first one is just let's create a first 2 digits first case. We're going to take this number and divide by 1, 2, 3, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we're going to divide by 1,000,000, okay? Because if we divide by 1,000,000, let's see here. So 2, 3, 0, 3, 2, 2, 3, 4. So if we divide by 10, what we're going to have? 2, 3, 0, 3, 2, 2, 3. Okay, if we do this division again, what are we going to have? This, right? I'm going to put this in the same place so you can see this decreasing the digits. This divided by 10. Oops. What is going to happen here? Equals to this, right? If we divide this by 10, what is going to appear? This, right? If we divide this by 10 again, oops. Let me just make things in the same line here. It's going to appear this, right? If we divide this by 10 again, what is going to appear? 23, right? So in each division by 10, we are taking out the last digit, because since we want to get the 2 first digits, we have to do this division how many times? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we're going to divide num by 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 times, okay, actually this. Okay, so we're going to divide this num here by 6 times of 10. What's 10 multiplied by 10? So 10 multiplied by 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 10. So this multiplication here is going to become 1,000,000, okay? That's the same thing that if we use the power, okay? So we can use this way here, we can divide by 1,000,000 and we're going to have the first 2 digits, or we can use the second way here, digits 2 equals to num divided by what? We have this poll function that takes 2 arguments, base value and power value, and returns the power raised to the base number. So, for example, if we have in here, let me see, enter the base number if we want 2.5 and the power raised 3.4, so we would have 2.5 in the power raised of 3.4, and we would have this value here. So what we can do is, since this is 10 multiplied by 10 6 times, we can just do poll, that is the poll function. The first part of this function here is what? Is the base value. So what's the base value? 10. The base value is this part here, right? So 10. And how many times 10 is being multiplied by itself? 6 times, okay? So this both, it's going to print the same number, because this both ways we're going to have these 2. This both ways we're going to have the same result. So I'm going to show you this. So case 1, I know it seems a little bit confusing, but this is more about math, so take a look of power, okay? And here we're going to print the case 2, and let's check if it works. So make problem 20. So yes, I forgot, this poll here, it's in the library of math.h, so we have to include this here, okay? So hash include math.h, okay? And let's check this again. So make problem 20, no problems with compiling, and do problem 20. So in the first case we get the 2 first digits. In the first case we are divided by million, and in the second case we are divided by million again, but we're just representing in a different way. We're representing in the power of 6, 10 in the power of 6, okay? So I hope you enjoyed this content. We're going to have more videos, so check it out, okay? Bye bye.